My brave lad, he sleeps in his faded coat of blue. In a lonely grave alone lies the heart that beats so true. They will find him and know him amongst the good and true, when a robe of white is given for that faded coat of blue. No more the bugle calls the wind.
Welcome to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I'm your host, Leon Mauser, and this is a reading of the regimental history under the Maltese Cross, Antietam to Appomattox, the Loyal Uprising in Western Pennsylvania, 1861 to 1865, Campaign's 155th Pennsylvania Regiment, narrated by the rank and file. This is Episode 16, Part 2 of Chapter 8, The Battle of Gettysburg, and let's get started right where we left off, the capture of Little Round Top. The last resting place of the troops on Powers Hill was occupied until late in the afternoon by Sykes' Fifth Corps. The artillery's lively play to the westward was heard without disturbing the serenity of the troops, and, strange to say, it seemed much more distant than it really was. The battle of the day with Sykes' Corps had actually opened, and the entire corps was soon set in motion towards the high ground which would be seen to the westward, and which, in fact, proved to be Little Round Top. The 1st Division of the 5th Corps, Brigadier General Barnes commanding, and the Brigade of the United States Regulars of Ayres Division, preceded the advance of Weed's Brigade to the left to the relief of General Sickles' Corps in its contest with Longstreet's columns. Sykes' Corps passed along the road, crossing the ridge at the foot of the northern extremity of Little Round Top. The two advanced brigades of Sykes' Corps under Colonels Vincent and Schweitzer soon became engaged in the furious battle at the farther side of Little Round Top. When Weed's brigade was marching across the ridge to join them, and had about reached the point where the railroad now crosses the roadway, the missiles of the enemy screeched over their heads. The 155th and other regiments were halted and ordered to load, which, when done, and before moving farther, an incident occurred which changed the line of march of Weed's brigade, and which proved to be a most important factor in the result of that day's battle. Early on the 2nd of July, a signal station had been located, by the orders of General Meade, on the summit of Little Round Top, then unoccupied by Union troops, with instructions to signal operations of the enemy. Just before the opening of the battle and the assault on Sickles' Corps in the Peach Orchard by Longstreet's forces, General G.K. Warren, chief engineer of General Meade's army, visited Little Round Top with Captain W.A. Roebling of his staff and made observations with field glasses from the summit which disclosed the movement of Longstreet's columns in the dense woods nearly opposite Little Round Top. And although the enemy was marching to avoid observation, the flashing of the bright steel guns and bayonets in the sunlight disclosed to Warren a strong column assembling opposite his position, being the extreme left of the Union Army. General Warren at once promptly directed the Signal Corps detail to communicate his timely discovery of Longstreet's movement to General Meade, with request that he order the 5th Corps troops then in reserve to immediately advance to occupy Little Round Top and the other positions in its front to check the movement of the enemy designed to flank or capture the position. The signal detail immediately complied with Warren's order, and General Meade ordered the 5th Corps from its reserve to at once advance at double quick and to the left, report to General Warren, and occupy the positions in front of Little Round Top, and also to occupy Little Round Top itself. Warren and Signal Corps. General Warren was wounded slightly in the neck while reconnoitering with his staff on Round Top. He insisted on the detail of Signal Corps remaining in position, waving their flags conspicuously so the enemy could see that the position was occupied by Union forces. while he dashed down the rocks to intercept Wheat's brigade to advance on Round Top. Note: Captain Roebling, the young officer above mentioned, subsequently served until the close of the war as engineer officer on the staff of Major General Warren, commanding 5th Corps, being promoted to colonel for gallant conduct. In civil life, he has attained national distinction as the engineer constructing the Great Brooklyn Bridge. Just at the time the command forward was about to be given, General G.K. Warren, Chief Engineer of the Army of the Potomac, with Captain W.A. Roebling, a staff officer, rode down towards the head of the 140th New York Regiment of Wheat's brigade from the direction of the summit of Little Round Top. His speed and manner indicated unusual excitement. Before reaching the 140th New York Regiment, which was bringing up the rear of the brigade, he called to Colonel O'Rourke to lead his regiment up the hill now known as Little Round Top. O'Rourke answered him that General Weed had gone ahead and expected the 140th to follow him. "Never mind that," answered Warren. "I'll take the responsibility." Warren's words and manner carried conviction of the importance of the thing he asked. Accepting Warren's assurance of full justification, O'Rourke turned the head of his regiment to the left and followed the staff officer who had been with Warren, leading it diagonally up to the eastern slope of Little Round Top. General Warren rode off evidently bent upon securing other troops. A few seconds later, the head of the 140th New York reached the summit of the ridge. The march to the relief of the left of Little Round Top was on the double quick, being, as stated, for the relief of the 3rd Corps, which was being severely pressed. The incident mentioned of General Warren separating the 140th New York from its brigade and having it countermarched and leading the way to the summit of Little Round Top was soon followed by General Warren's order to General Weed to have the other regiments of the brigade about face and double quick to follow the 140th New York in the occupation of Little Round Top. While thus double quicking into position, the 155th was under a heavy fire of the enemy. Captain S.A. McKee of Company I was struck with a ball on the arm, and Color Corporal John Mackin of Company F was also wounded before reaching Little Round Top. The 155th, on the reserve march of Weed's brigade in ascending Little Round Top, was in the rear, the 91st Pennsylvania and the 146th New York having preceded it. Death of Weed, O'Rourke, and Hazlitt. Little Round Top is an eminence covered with immense rocks and boulders and small timber, and, at the time of the battle, had no roads, thus making it inaccessible. These impediments made it impossible for the battery of horses of Captain Hazlitt's 5th United States Artillery to haul the cannon up the steep hill. A squad of the 155th assisted in hauling up the 4 pieces to the summit of Little Round Top, where the battery did most effective execution. The Bucktails of the Pennsylvania Reserves, who had been detailed because of their long-range arms and their skill as sharpshooters, immediately left the front of the regiment and, advancing over the rocks as skirmishers, soon answered the strong force of Confederate sharpshooters in the rocks known as the Devil's Den. So accurate was the range of these Confederate sharpshooters concealed in the rocks of Devil's Den, in the immediate front of the 155th, that Brigadier General Stephen H. Weed, who had just succeeded in capturing Little Round Top and posting his men in position, was among the first picked off. Colonel Patrick H. O'Rourke, commander of the 140th New York, whose regiment led the advance of Weed's brigade in the capture of Little Round Top, encountered a regiment of Confederates near the summit seeking to capture the position and, in resisting this advance with sword in hand inspiring his regiment, was instantly killed by a minie-ball in the head. The struggle here was very severe, and the loss of the 140th New York in killed and wounded was very heavy. The 140th New York held the position thus gained until reinforced by the 146th New York under Colonel Kenner Garrett, the 91st Pennsylvania, Colonel Sinix, and the 155th Pennsylvania, Colonel John H. Cain, the remaining regiments of Weed's brigade, thus strengthening this naturally strong position against any attack of the enemy. The sharpshooters from Devil's Den continued their fire on these regiments as they were ascending Little Round Top. Captain Charles E. Hazlitt, 5th United States Artillery, who had so promptly occupied Little Round Top with Battery D, fell a victim to Confederate sharpshooters' aim soon after gaining the position. Captain Hazlitt was killed while stooping over conversing with General Weed, who had been mortally wounded and carried back. It was a particularly sad sight to the remaining regiments of Weed's brigade as they reached the summit of Little Round Top to see their beloved commander's dead body and that of the popular Colonel O'Rourke exposed to view as the regiments were taking positions. After thus securing the heights by the repulse of the enemy by Weed's and Vincent's brigades, a lull in the battle lasting half an hour or more occurred, during which the 155th and other regiments of the brigade were ordered, from the abundance of stone and small rocks in the vicinity, to construct stone walls instead of earthworks, to protect themselves from the attacks of the enemy. But little time was lost in thus, from the abundance of material, constructing these defenses which afforded ample protection to the men against the Confederate sharpshooters in Devil's Den. So perfect, however, was the range of these Confederate sharpshooters that frequently the men of the 155th would place their caps upon their bayonets and expose the same above the top of their stone wall breastworks, as if being on the head of a soldier, to draw the fire of the enemy's sharpshooters. Their shots never failed to perforate the cap thus exposed. This exposure, however, of the cap on the bayonet, projected above the top of the stone walls used as defenses, was given a very practical turn to the benefit the troops occupying Little Round Top. The details from the Pennsylvania Bucktails and Berdan's sharpshooters, who had been detailed to the companies behind the stone wall occupied by the 155th, having telescopic rifles, answered the shots of the Confederates in Devil's Den when they fired at the exposed caps above the stone wall. When the enemy sharpshooters fired, the Bucktails sharpshooters were enabled to observe whence the little curl of smoke emanated, and consequently, with deadly aim, returned the fire of the Confederate behind the little column of smoke in the rocks of Devil's Den below. That this fire of the Union sharpshooters was very effective was disclosed later, when the 5th Corps lines, after the repulse of Pickett's charge, were advanced beyond Devil's Den, revealing scores of dead Confederate sharpshooters in the rocks, crevices, and recesses of the den. During the lull mentioned in the battle, except the sharpshooters' fire, succeeding the capture of Little Round Top by Weed's brigade, the opportunity of obtaining a view of the enemy was perfect to the occupants of Little Round Top. The Confederates seemed to be engaged in forming a column or making movements to renew the attack by a superior force, with a view of either capturing or flanking Little Round Top. Renewal of attack by Robertson's Texans. During this lull in the fighting with smaller arms, the enemy opened a tremendous artillery fire against Little Round Top from a large number, 40 or 50, of their heaviest guns, almost causing the earth to quake among the rocks surmounting Little Round Top. The Confederate fire, however, although rapid and continuous, was inaccurate in aim, and for the most part went over Little Round Top, doing but little harm to the troops occupying it. General Meade's artillery, which was well posted, accepted the artillery challenge of the enemy and answered in kind with an equal number of guns, but, for some reason, the Union artillery after half an hour ceased firing while the cannonading of the Confederates was still active. The men of Weed's and Vincent's brigades could plainly see the formation of large columns of the enemy in the plain below, maneuvering for renewal of the attack on Little Round Top. The bad range of the latter's artillery firing did not prevent the officers and men occupying Little Round Top from following the movements of the enemy opposite very closely. They saw the Confederate officers, when their line of battle was formed, dismount and with sword in hand, lead their columns on in great force. Hazlitt's battery, on Little Round Top, to the command of which Lieutenant B.F. Rittenhouse had succeeded, and other adjacent batteries, had perfect range of the formidable lines of the enemy, which had been massed as an attacking column against Little Round Top. This grand attacking force was led by the Confederate General Hood with his Texan troops. The destructive aim of the artillery on Little Round Top and the adjacent batteries, as the shots and shells shattered the Confederate column, thus massed for the attack, was plainly visible. The bravery and determination of the enemy in so boldly and courageously disregarding this destructive direct and enfilading fire elicited the admiration of the officers and men who were awaiting the attack. No sooner had one company of the Confederate column been scattered by the bursting shells than its place was taken promptly and in good order by others. On came the advancing column across the open fields and across the stream, Willoughby Run, undaunted and determined. Wheat's brigade had not long been in the occupation of the position on the rocky heights thus secured until the foe, under Longstreet's direction, made a diversion from the attacks on the Third Corps and assaulted along the whole line of Wheat's brigade, with Hood's Texans and other troops, in efforts to carry the Union position on Little Round Top. From these heights, occupied by Wheat's brigade on the summit, the maneuvering and preparations of the enemy were plainly visible in front of the 155th. The United States Regular Brigade of General Ayres' division had advanced to the relief of Sickles, but, although making a most obstinate resistance and falling back on the retreat as if on drill, the regulars were finally overpowered and driven back. They rallied frequently and did much execution on the attacking column, but they could not contend against the overwhelming numbers in the attacking party. After the repulse of the regulars immediately in front of Little Round Top, the enemy emerged from the woods opposite to the point from which they had driven the regulars and directed their attention to the position of Weed's and Vincent's brigades, occupying the summits of Little Round Top, a half-mile distant. The 155th, as has been already stated, was at a disadvantage compared with other regiments in this part of the action, as its arms consisted of the old Harper's Ferry muskets, using only buck and ball shot for ammunition and being effective only at very short range. As a consequence, the regiment, from its position, was obliged to witness this advancing column of the enemy across the open plain for a quarter of a mile in front of Little Round Top, and see them march triumphantly to the foot of the same, and to continue the advance until they were within 20 yards before the regiment was allowed to shoot across the stone wall at the enemy. From this handicap, the other regiments of the brigade, having arms of longer range, began firing at the enemy first, and necessarily checked the enemy's advance in that direction. Not receiving any immediate fire from the part of the line occupied by the 155th, the Confederate officers, believing it to be a break in that position and not defended, directed Robertson's brigade of Texans to the point in front of the 155th. Colonel Cain, commanding, however, and the captains of all the companies were strict in enforcing the orders that not a shot should be fired until the enemy got close within range. When the enemy's advance reached that distance, the order was given by Colonel Cain and repeated by the company commanders to fire and to aim low. The effect was immediate and checked the enemy with fatal results, not sufficient, however, to stop their onward attack and advanced to within not less than 20 feet of the Union line, where their officers and men rallied and poured destructive volleys into the firing line. Occupied by the 155th, this perilous position the enemy maintained for fully half an hour, returning volley for volley until their losses compelled their retreat and abandonment of their attempt to capture Little Round Top. In this second storming of the position, in this repulse of the enemy and their effort to capture the position, great loss was sustained by the 155th, and a number of its most valued and beloved members gave up their lives on this occasion. While thus exposed and suffering considerable loss in repulsing the attack made by Hood's men on the position, defended by the regiments of Wheat's brigade, it was a matter of astonishment to all concerned, in view of the closeness of the range and the number of volleys fired by the Confederates, that many more casualties were not reported. Without exaggeration, it can be said with truth that the enemy's bullets flew thick and fast, and it is only owing to the poor marksmanship that their firing was not more destructive. This can be explained only by the fact that the enemy being below the position occupied by Wheat's brigade and firing uphill, their bullets fell short of the mark. After this repulse of the enemy, and their withdrawal from the slopes of Little Round Top to the Devil's Den, their picket line, many sharpshooters of the Bucktails from the Brigade of the Pennsylvania Reserves, and from Berdan's, took positions in the rocks and crevices on Little Round Top in advance of the positions of the Union main line and of the skirmishers, and rendered the most effectual work in driving out from Devil's Den and adjacent rocks the remaining squads of sharpshooters who had lingered in concealed positions. Charge of Pennsylvania Reserves on enemy's pickets. By orders of General Meade, who was inspecting Little Round Top during the action, General Fisher's and McCandless brigades of the Pennsylvania Reserves advanced to clear the rocks on the left slope of Little Round Top, still occupied by many of the enemy's sharpshooters, and also to establish an advanced picket line in front of Vincent's brigade. The brigades of reserves advanced and gained the ground, driving a few sharpshooters and advanced pickets of the enemy from the points lately occupied by Robertson's Confederates back to their own line, which was held by the Confederate General Law's division. After the repulse of Robertson's Texans, among the wounded who came up from the base of Little Round Top was Major William G. Moorhead of the 17th United States Infantry, which had suffered so severely at the opening of the Battle of Little Round Top by the 5th Corps. Major Moorhead, being so well known as the son of Pittsburgh Congressman Honorable J.K. Moorhead, his appearance in bleeding condition attracted the notice and sympathy of his friends in the 155th Regiment as he passed through the regiment to the field hospital. The occupants of Little Round Top were not doomed to further interruption from the enemy, either by bombardment or skirmishing during the remainder of the day or night of the 2nd of July. The cries and groans of the thousands of the wounded of both armies lying between the lines of the contending armies, and also many within the lines, the latter being removed by ambulance, could be heard distinctly all night, disturbing the slumbers of many wearied soldiers. Little Round Top, being about 280 feet in height and exceeding rough and rocky, afforded no soft couches upon which the rest of the weary bones of the men of the 155th and the other regiments of Wheat's brigade on the night following this day's battle. The huge boulders and rocks interspersed on the summit of Little Round Top, many boulders being as large as from 6 to 20 feet long and having their rough edges and surface smoothed by time, furnished beds from 2 or 3 comrades, while others, fearing a renewal of the enemy's bombardment during the night, pitched their poncho beds behind the rocks on the bare earth, so that there were all kinds of couches and places of repose. However, no midnight attack or volleys or firing in front took place during the night. Early in the morning of the 3rd of July, the reveille was not sounded as usual, but instead the captains and other officers quietly visited the sleeping places of the men and roused them to be on the alert and ready in case the enemy suddenly renewed their attacks upon this most significant position of Little Round Top. All the morning of the 3rd, the enemy made no attack, being engaged in preparing for battle and generally arranging for attacks or charges along the Union line, in hopes of regaining the lost ground of the day previous. Simultaneously with the opening of the enemy's batteries on the 2nd, as already stated, General Hunt, commanding the Union artillery, gave orders for an immediate reply, and, as stated, for half an hour, the Union batteries directed an enfilading and direct fire, concentrated, with excellent aim, upon the enemy's positions in front of Little Round Top. During this heavy earthquaking bombardment, officers and men of the 5th Corps were ordered to seek positions of shelter afforded by the large boulders and rocks so abundant on Little Round Top, there to remain until the enemy's artillery fire had ceased or orders to resume position in battle line were received. It was terrifying at times, behind the immense rocks, when a shell, short of range, would burst in the air and strike some of the men hugging the rocks or ground adjacent. George R. Kerr, a private of Company H, and Lieutenant D. Lyon, of the same company, were both wounded from the fragments of shells, thus striking them in their supposedly safe positions. For the most part, however, the enemy's heaviest fire missed the range entirely of the troops on Little Round Top, and the missiles and explosives alighted some distance in the rear, in many cases damaging and wounding the occupants of the field hospitals there located. Indeed, on this occasion, the amputations necessary to be undergone by the wounded carried back to the field hospital were interrupted because of the severity of the enemy's shelling, which reached far beyond the rear of the Union lines. Battery D, 5th United States Artillery, on the summit of Little Round Top, already mentioned, whose commander, Captain Charles E. Hazlitt, and many of its enlisted men, had been picked off by the enemy sharpshooters early in the action, and details from the infantry replaced the fallen. Activity of Confederate Sharpshooters. The presence of the Confederate sharpshooters among the rocks and crevices of Devil's Den, and their deadly aim, which had resulted in the picking off of General Weed, Colonel O'Rourke, and Captain Hazlitt, and the wounding of General Warren, besides killing and wounding so many men of the rank and file, caused General Meade to detail 2 companies of Berdan's New York sharpshooters to the position occupied by the battery mentioned, and the troops of Weed's brigade. The Berdans had telescopic rifles, and, in securing positions and to avoid their own exposure, they could be seen creeping on hands and knees to get behind rocks or protecting crevices on the slopes of Little Round Top, from which to respond with deadly aim to the Confederate sharpshooters in Devil's Den and vicinity. Notwithstanding that the 155th was behind the rocks and boulders and the stone wall it erected on carrying the position on July 2nd, and the concealed skirmishing of the Bucktail and Berdan sharpshooters in front of the enemy's pickets, the Confederate sharpshooters, from their hiding places in Devil's Den, promptly fired at any soldier who exposed himself. Hence, it was necessary under the strict orders of the officers of Weed's brigade for the men to keep under shelter of the stone wall and surrounding rocks. About 10 o'clock on the morning of the 3rd of July, the enemy opened a very heavy artillery fire on the right of the Union line near Gettysburg, and kept it up continuously for several hours. In the afternoon, 3 large columns of Confederates were seen emerging from the woods to the right of Little Round Top, as if to renew yesterday's maneuver and contest. Battery D, 5th United States Artillery, which was being supported by the 155th in the morning, consisting of 4 guns, opened a very exact fire of shell and canister, the range being exact on the enemy's columns. The Confederate lines thus advancing endured several enfilading volleys from Battery D and also from the batteries adjacent. This finally caused the advancing columns of the enemy to retreat and to regain the cover of the woods from which they had emerged for the threatened movement. The Confederates then resumed the shelling of the position occupied by Weed's brigade on Little Round Top, with a view of silencing the destructive fire of Battery D. As stated, in command of Lieutenant B.F. Rittenhouse, USA, who succeeded the lamented Hazlitt. An artillery duel. This renewal of the shelling of the position on Little Round Top was light when compared with the awful earthquaking shelling to which those positions were treated by the Confederates later in the afternoon, from 140 guns of the Confederates posted on commanding positions immediately opposite the Union lines. A bombardment all along the line, including Little Round Top, took place. This artillery fire was promptly replied to by every battery, 80 and upwards in number, from the heights and positions opposite occupied by the Union forces. This great artillery duel continued more than an hour and was terrific in the extreme, surpassing any other occurring during the war. It was not so destructive in casualties as it might have been, the Confederate gunners failing to secure the proper range, and, as in the previous bombardments, the shells went so far over the heads of those on Little Round Top as to do practically no harm. The shells lighted half a mile and often a mile in the rear of Little Round Top. The immense rock and boulders found upon this elevation, and the stone walls which the regiment of Wheat's brigade had built for their protection along the line occupied by them on Little Round Top, rendered excellent shelter from the enemy's artillery fire. These timely stone walls were a perfect protection from the enemy's sharpshooters. They stopped the Minnie-balls perfectly, but they would have been of no protection against the shot or shell of the enemy striking them in the front. There was very little musketry firing beyond the skirmish on the left of the position occupied by the 5th and the 3rd Corps, but there was a formation plainly visible from Little Round Top about 1 p.m. that day of large columns of the enemy on the right of Little Round Top, near the center of the Union line. It was supposed at that time that the cause of the terrific artillery duel against Little Round Top and other positions of the Union forces was to cover an attack to follow on some part of the Union line by columns of infantry, the usual tactics of the Confederates under General Lee. That the fighting on the Union right occupied by Hancock were so severe was known from the roll of musketry which was plainly heard, and also from the many exploding caissons on either side struck by explosive shells from the batteries exchanging fire at short range. Finally, the cheering all along the Union line reached Little Round Top, and the word was passed along the line that the Confederates' great charge under Pickett had failed. Pickett's charge, as seen from Little Round Top. From Little Round Top, under shelter from the heavy bombardments of Longstreet's batteries, which opened on the Union center simultaneously with the assault of Pickett's troops, which could be seen in the distant panorama, Pickett's columns advancing on their fatal charge. From the same position on Little Round Top could be seen the lines of the gallant 2nd Corps ready and eager to welcome Pickett's attacking column. Prominent among the division commanders under General Hancock was General Alexander Hayes, commanding a division on the advancing firing line. During the hottest of the fray, General Hayes seemed to bear a charmed life as he rode out along the Union lines, cheering and stimulating his column to stand firm in the approaching assault, exposing himself recklessly. After Pickett's columns were finally driven back, a Union general rode up to General Hayes, whose command occupied a position adjoining what has been called the high water mark of the battle for the Confederates in the center of the Union line, and said, "Well, General Hayes, the rebels penetrated my line." Hayes replied with just pride, "Well, General, they failed to penetrate the line of my division." General Hayes's division is credited with having captured 30 Confederate flags in the action, receipts for which were sent him by the War Department. The close of this day's battle on the Union right and the cessation of hostilities on the left occurred at sunset. The night of the 3rd, like the night of the 2nd, was one again of anxious solicitude. The groans and cries of the wounded still on the battlefield, as well as the heavy loss in able officers and many thousands of the rank on the Union side, as the result of the 3 days' conflict, made all feel solicitous for the morrow. Chapter 9. Scenes and Incidents of the Battle of Gettysburg, which we will pick up next week, my friends. This episode is to make up for the last 2 weeks. I'm sorry to keep you all waiting on part 2 of the Battle of Gettysburg. I know. I decided I was not going to split this episode into 3 parts so that you would have one long continuous story of the struggle for Little Round Top. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg has been covered extensively, so I will not dwell on who was where and when, and just stay focused right here on the action for the 155th and maybe some other little parts. I will, however, put several other items for you to check out on my website and in the show notes. First of that being a battlefield tour of Little Round Top with Ranger Matt Atkinson of the Gettysburg National Park Service. Although he does not cover the 155th in this, you can briefly see the monument off to the right, but you also get to understand the struggle that's happening to the left of the 155th. Also going to include, with Battlefield Trust's Gary Edelman and Chris White, a video titled The Assault on Little Round Top at Gettysburg, Gettysburg episode 158. This episode does show the exact position of the 155th on Little Round Top, plus their monument. So you get to see where they were, and they are talked about, which is good. It's actually hard to find for these guys. So that's about 15 minutes into the video, but I recommend sitting down with your favorite drink and really just letting them talk through the whole thing. They are quite excellent, of course, and they have an entire playlist of battlefield guides. All right, let's get on and talk about the battle. Now, not the whole thing, of course, but those are just this whole section is going to be covered for the Battle of Little Round Top. In those 2 videos, you'll be set and you'll good to go. And that's probably about 2 hours worth. So, and I also want to stick with just the soldier's perspective on this. But the first thing that I thought of when I was reading this, and of course I read the whole thing, and then I edit it, and then I go back and I listen to it, and then I just write down what I want to talk about. But the first thing that I thought of when Gouverneur K. Warren sees those bayonets and knows that the enemy is coming is the exact same thing that happened at the Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the Civil War. As Confederates who were on the left flank also see the flashing of bayonets off in the distance of flanking Union soldiers. And this is why, my friends, that modern weapons are blued, and even the bayonets, and that's like a special coating that goes on it that darkens them, so that shining bayonets and weapons will not give your position away. Now, I've also included a C-SPAN video from 2001 that's all about Gouverneur K. Warren, which I watched while I was sick last week. It's 50 minutes. I highly recommend it. It talks all about him. Now, he's been extensively covered, not just in this video, but in others as well. He does have a big statue of him at Gettysburg for a reason. So I'm also going to include his Wikipedia. Now, the next major character that we're going to move on to is Captain Roebling, who also constructed the Brooklyn Bridge. That's pretty cool. I've got his Wikipedia page for you as well. And also the National Museum of Industrial History has a video on his life. Though I must confess, I put it on in the background while I was doing dishes. So it was pretty good for what I was listening to. But there's actually lots of videos about him. And moving on, of all of the 3 men who were killed in this chapter, who get like their own special shout out, I put links to all their Wikipedias, so you can search them up individually if you like. But this gives something to read about them, why they were singled out in particular, and all are mentioned in Gettysburg videos, it seems as well. And that's going to be Brigadier General Weed, Captain Hazlitt, and Colonel O'Rourke. So those are all going to be on my website as well. Now, moving out of the way about specific characters, let's talk about Union soldiers putting their covers on their bayonets to trick Confederate sharpshooters to shoot at them. That is genius and hilarious. And I'm sure it really helped with the Bucktails, and Berdan's sharpshooters really appreciated that trick as the 155th was keeping those boys busy. It does also let you know what kind of struggle was happening at this time, though, right? They talk a lot about sharpshooting and what was happening between them and the people at Devil's Den. Now, listening about the description of the Confederates getting smashed by artillery as they approached Little Round Top, my goodness, it does take considerable courage to accomplish such a feat, to just walk out in the open, and especially over rough terrain while there's cannon shells exploding around you and through you. And I admire the description that was given, and it's a great job of taking account of the battle. I'll leave the soldiers' words to do the work on that section. But now, the U.S. regulars in front of Round Top who were fighting the Confederates, quite a bit about them, as apparently the volunteers were incredibly impressed by their ability to fight and die. Apparently they were essentially doing drill maneuvers while they were under fire and while they were leaving, and then they broke and ran. According to some sources, they differ. I've been looking it up to find out what the true story is, but obviously with any battle, there's always conflicting accounts. But makes it very interesting. Now, the 155th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment having to use buck and ball and shooting the advancing rebels. Let's picture this for a moment. The whole of the rebel line is being fired upon, except to your front, and you're advancing up to Little Round Top. And there's this steep hill, and there's nobody in front of you, it seems. And in the minds of some of those Confederate soldiers, it must have felt like a lucky break, especially when you can see up the hill and you can see where all the firing is coming from. Only to have the 155th open fire when you got really close, and with buck and ball no less. I have also included a video of what buck and ball looks like, and it essentially turns muskets into shotguns. They have a full-sized ball round and then smaller ones put in with it. And lucky enough for us, the YouTube channel, Paper Cartridges, actually shows us what it was like to shoot buck and ball and exactly why the 155th Regiment waited for the rebels to get so close. It's a 4-minute video. Check it out. It's going to be on the website in the link. And speaking of which, rebellionstories.com, that's my website. It's just for information only. And when you check it out, click on the title that says Episode 16, Part 2 of Chapter 8, The Battle of Gettysburg. And that will show all the pictures from the history and all of these links to all these videos and websites that I've compiled together all in one location. So you can just scroll through it, click on things as you go and things that you find interesting and skip over others if you like. But the specific phrase that they use is checked the enemy with fatal results. I mean, it's like 400 shotguns all going off into a group of rebels who thought their front was clear. So I bet it checked them, but then didn't to fight at less than 20 feet in front of the 155th for a half hour. I wonder if the rebels were maybe hugging the ground rather than standing, whether the men they were facing might have been new or however it might have been going on, or just like the swirl of battle. But to be honest, I haven't looked at the Confederate side of this battle to see what they have said, because there's just so much that you have to read that goes into this. So if you know the answer, by all means reach out to me. I'm sure there's a historian out there who knows. Regarding the Pennsylvania Reserves charge, I was able to find an article from historynet.com. I wanted to read a small section of that, and it was compiled by Glenn W. LaFatense, titled Last Assault on Little Round Top. And I quote, "No one among the driving Pennsylvanians was more enthusiastic than the boys from Adams County and Company K, 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, who helped push the Confederate advance back across the valley. These local boys had, according to one veteran, chased many a rabbit all over these hills, and gathered berries in these valleys, and played hide and seek among these rocks and boulders. Now they dashed towards the enemy, crossed the marshy ground across Plum Run, and advanced towards the wheat field. They swept the retiring Confederates from their front with admirable courage and determination. The Confederates retreated without stopping much to fire their muskets." Unquote. And I'll also go ahead and include the article for that so you can read the full thing, or read the full article if you desire. And now to talk about, being shelled by artillery when you're in the rear, getting your arm lopped off. That must have been incredibly obnoxious and frustrating, to put it lightly. As far as moving on, as far as Pickett's charge goes in the history, I'm just going to leave that how it is, but I'm going to include a video from a reenactment to show the size and scale of Pickett's charge. As the closest we'll ever get is when more than 20,000 reenactors from all over the world, on July 5th, 1998, participated in the largest historical reenactment ever held, up until that point, I'm assuming, on Bushy Farm, only 6 miles from the Gettysburg battlefield. It was almost a full scale of Pickett's charge and Longstreet's assault. Now there's 2 videos I'm going to include here. These are both from the Lionworks YouTube channel. They did upload the full version of this video. So the first one shows just Pickett's charge. So if you just want to see what 10,000 Confederates look like coming across in a rebuilt Cemetery Ridge battle, then by all means come check it out. It is incredibly impressive and very terrifying. They also have another video. It's about an hour and a half long, and it is the full reenactment of the battle. And that also includes the second day's battle. So you'll get to see how they prepared and did the entire battle of the second day. There's not a lot that you get to see from the Union side. They they did make it so you get to kind of take a look. And second day's battle doesn't get a whole lot, but they do have both generals from both sides who sit there and they talk to you in the video about why they were doing this and how the battle went. It's just an impressive video. And then it covers all 3 days of the reenactment battle. I wish I had been there, but I was only 10 years old at the time. So that's the end of my notes today, and we will wrap up this particularly long episode, and our normally weekly schedule will pick up again next week. So go to my website, rebellionstories.com, and also leave any reviews on whatever podcasting app you're using. It really does help me, and I mean it. And you can email me at waroftherebellion@gmail.com if you'd like to chat or talk. I'm always checking my emails, but all I get are bill reminders. So, my friends, I'll see you next week. And since I have you listening, you can donate, of course, to battlefields.org, which is the Battlefield Trust organization to help preserve American battlefields. Or, like I did this week, you can donate to the Ukrainian government, who's currently fighting for their sovereignty and democracy. I will include links to both. Just toss them both $10. I mean, come on, why not? I'm going to be reading these regimental histories for the next 30 years, and they're going to be free the entire time, so, help me out, will you? And it's for charity, and I'll include links to both. With that, my friends, I will see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
When a robe of white is given for that faded coat of blue, no more the bugle calls the weary one. Rest, noble spirit, in thy grave alone. They will find you and know you amongst the good and true. When a robe of white is given for that faded coat of blue. He cried, give me water and just one little crumb, and my mother, she will bless you through all the years to come. Go tell my sweet sister, so gentle, good and true, that I'll meet her up in heaven in my faded coat of blue. No more the bugle calls the weary one. Rest, noble spirit, in thy grave alone. They will find you and know you amongst the good and true. When a robe of white is given for that faded